Okay, so we'll start now. My name is Rushi Shete, and I welcome you all to the event of Zenith Astronomy Club with Shutter Speed Photography Club of BJGMC. And today we have with us Varun Jorapur, who has completed his degree in physics from IIT Kanpur and is now doing a PhD in physics at Yale University in the USA. And in Kanpur, he was an active member of the astronomy club and was part of a team that built the university's first observatory. And he also won the Inter IIT Messier Marathon. For those of you who do not know, Messier Marathon is an overnight event in which you have to, using a telescope, you have to record over 100 plus Messier objects within the span of that night. And it requires a great deal of efficiency and precision with the telescope and with the deep sky. So it's a really commendable achievement. And without any further ado, I'll directly hand it over to him so that we can start the session. Okay, Varun, over to you.
Thank you, Rushi. Let me share my screen. Okay, so hello everyone, and thanks Rushi for the wonderful introduction, and thank you everyone for joining me today for this talk. So when Rushi asked me to make a talk about astrophotography for everyone, I wasn't very sure how I should go about it. Mainly because astrophotography is such a vast hobby, and whenever people see these wonderful photos, they think, oh my God, it has like it's really difficult to take these photos. But what I want to show you today is that while it's true that astrophotography takes a lot of effort, it's also accessible to everyone. And so I hope that by the end of my talk today, you have some fresh new ideas on what you can do with the equipment you have, and what is also possible with new equipment. So before I begin, I'd just like to say that I want this talk to be interactive. So if any of you have any questions at any point, I guess you can type it in the chat, and then Rushi, you can ask the question to me. So feel free to ask any questions. The more you ask, the more you'll understand, and the more fun it will be for everyone. So let me begin by saying that for me, if anyone wants to do astrophotography, they have to know both astronomy and they also have to know photography. And so the first part of this talk is going to be about the basics of astronomy and photography, where I hope to bring everyone on the same page about these two concepts. And then after that, we'll dive into astrophotography and sort of what kinds of images you can capture, and what you can hope to do with astrophotography. So whenever you go out and look up at the night, you can see this seemingly endless array of stars just randomly arranged in the night sky. And every major civilization, or humankind actually, has been interested in the night sky since times immemorial. And every major civilization has attempted to study this night sky in one form or another. So foremost amongst them were the Greeks, who divided these night sky into these constellations. So the Greeks thought that these patterns of stars in the night sky, they look kind of like their gods, and so they divided it up into these patterns that we call constellations. And these constellations are very useful. So for example, I can use this constellation here called Ursa Major. And I can use it to find north, because I know that if I see this pattern in the night sky, and if I join these two stars and extend a straight line, then the star here is Polaris, which is the pole star. Similarly, I know that if here is Cassiopeia and these two stars, I can see these two stars, and if I draw a perpendicular bisector and go extend that line all the way here, then again I come to the pole star. So these kinds of constellations are useful to get your bearings at night. But more importantly, these are also useful to find some of those very faint deep sky objects that we want to image. So for example, here is Perseus, and I know that it has this typical Y shape in the night sky. And so if I extend this arm of the Y, then I know that somewhere here there will be the star cluster Pleiades, which is very beautiful to image. So because most of these objects that we want to image are not visible, knowing these constellations is very important to be able to find them in the night sky. So the first thing I would say for anyone who wants to do astrophotography is, go out and look up and familiarize yourself with the night sky. And there are a few important programs or few useful programs that you can use. For example, I personally love this program, Stellarium. It's a free program, it's a free software, and it's very handy for browsing the night sky. I always use it before I go out, and it's very useful. Another program is called is this ProWatch, which is useful to polar align your mount, which I'll talk about later. But yeah, I would say if you want to do astrophotography, really go out and look up and just figure out what the night sky is about. So the next thing that we should know is that the sky rotates with a period of 24 hours. So as you can see in this photo here, if you follow any of this, each of these trails, it's a single star, and I've taken this photo. Each frame is 1 minute apart, so you can see that over the course of around 2 hours, a star has moved by this much. And so the point of astrophotography is that you want to image these faint objects. So you want to counteract this motion of the Earth, and you want to be able to continuously capture the same object. So the way to do this is that we use these kinds of mounts in astronomy, and there are two kinds of mounts. So first is this alt-as mount, which is a very useful, very trivial mount. It has a very simple motion. It goes up and down, left and right. But this kind of mount cannot really track the night sky. So we do not really use this kind of mount for astrophotography. However, there's this other kind of mount called an equatorial mount. And the special part of this mount is that this axis of this mount, there's one axis that is always aligned with the axis of the Earth. So if you imagine that we put a motor on this axis, then it will always track the object in the night sky. And this kind of mount is what we use for astrophotography. So another thing that we should know about astronomy is, there are two kinds of telescopes. One is what we call a Newtonian or a reflector telescope, where there is this mirror, and it reflects the light, and it goes to your eye. And these kinds of telescopes, they're very easy to build, but they're also a kind of low quality optics. And so because they're so easy and cheap to build, they're mainly used for visual astronomy because you can get very large mirrors, and so you can see the objects better. But there is this other kind of telescope, which is a refractor telescope. And these kinds of these kinds of telescopes are actually like your camera lens, because there is just this lens, and it focuses the light onto your eye. So these are much more expensive to build, but they're also very high quality optics. And so these are mostly used for astrophotography. And finally, one last thing that you need to know about telescopes is that they're characterized by two important numbers called focal length and aperture. So the focal length is the distance from the mirror to the from the mirror where the light is focused onto your eye. And so this determines the magnification of the telescope. So if you have a larger focal length, you will be able to see objects much closer. And the other number is aperture, which is the light collection capacity of your telescope. And that is the aperture, which is this diameter of the mirror or of the lens. And light collection actually is directly proportional to the square of your aperture. So if you have, let's say, a 6-inch diameter telescope versus an 8-inch diameter telescope, then the 8-inch actually collects approximately 2 times more the light than a 6-inch telescope. And so, when you're choosing a telescope, or if ever you want to buy a telescope, you have to keep these two factors in mind. And for astrophotography, we really want to maximize the light collection capacity because we want to be able to see these dim, faint objects. And so the larger the aperture, the better. So that ends my section on astronomy basics. So I would say, familiarize yourself with the night sky, go out, look up, figure out what constellations you can see. And then we use a refractor with an equatorial mount mainly for astrophotography. And so these two the magnification is directly proportional to the focal length, and the light collection is directly proportional to the square of the aperture. So if anyone has any questions so far, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll go ahead to the photography section. Um, so there are a few things that we need to know about photography, which is the first is a shutter speed, or how long the camera sensor is collecting light. And so most cameras have these settings where you can go from 1/8,000th of a second all the way to 30 seconds or even bulb. And bulb is a mode where, as long as you're clicking the shutter, the camera is collecting light. And so most astrophotography is actually done in this bulb mode, because you want to decide how you want to actually control how long you're taking light for. Then the next thing that we need to know is ISO, which is the sensor sensitivity. So most cameras again have settings that go from 100 to over 12,800. And ISO is actually, so 100 is the least sensitive, and 12,800 is the most sensitive. But because you're also increasing the sensitivity as you go down here, you're also making the camera more noisy. Um, so uh, so 12,800, while it will show you bright images, it will also be very noisy because you're sensitive to all these other fluctuations. Um, and so we can combine these two concepts of ISO and exposure into one number called the image brightness, which is just ISO times exposure. So as you can see in these two photos, this one was taken with an ISO of 6400 for a 15 seconds exposure, and this one was ISO 3200 for a 30-second exposure. So the brightness in both of these is the same, and you can really see that if you compare identical parts of the Milky Way to each other. So if you look at this part and if you look at this part, they look pretty much the same. But if you zoom in now into this photo, and if you compare two of the same parts, then you can see that this 6400 ISO image is actually more noisy than the 3200 ISO image. And you can see that because there are all of these random dots that are appearing in the background, which is not as much in this photo. But because this was only a 15-second exposure, the stars are still looking like circles. But in this photo here, the stars, because it's a 30-second exposure, there's some trailing, and you can see that because the stars are more like lines. So you have to whenever you're choosing these kinds of settings for astrophotography, you have to balance these two things, and you have to keep in mind that the longer you expose for, the more trailing you'll get, but the images will be a little bit cleaner. So there is no one ideal setting, and whenever you're trying to take photos, you have to experiment and find the right sort of settings for your sky and for your camera. So the next thing that we'll be looking at is aperture, which is for most lenses, it's excuse me, is denoted by this F number, which is defined as focal length over diameter. And so you can see that most camera lenses have variable F number, so you can change how much your lens is collecting light. And for astrophotography, we always want to collect the maximum amount of light, so we want the least F number. So ideally we would have this F 1.4 for astrophotography. And then the last thing is white balance. So white balance, I'll not talk much about, like I won't go into the technical details, but it's basically setting where the white point of your image is. So where white color will be. And I will just say that for most cameras, auto white balance works well. But there are some cases where you have to be careful. For example, here's this photo with bad white balance, and you can see that it's looking green, whereas we know that the night sky is not green. But this is an instance with better white balance where it's more natural looking. So whenever you're doing, again, out taking photos, take a test photo, see what your white balance is, and make sure all of your settings are correct. And for most cameras, auto white balance works fine. So that ends my section on photography. And so again, to recap, shutter speed is how long the camera will capture photons, and we want it to be as much as possible. And so usually we use the camera on bulb mode. ISO is the gain or the sensitivity of the camera. And so we can define brightness, which is ISO times shutter speed. and then the aperture is denoted by the f number, and we want it to be as low as possible because we want to capture as much light as possible. And finally, the white balance, which is setting the white point. Um, so now let me actually, since we've more or less familiarized ourselves with the basics of astronomy and the basics of photography, let me now go a little bit and start going into astrophotography.
Varun,
Yes.
just before that, we have a doubt. For a beginner, what should be the focal length and aperture of a telescope?
Um, yeah. So for that's a good question. And so I would say for a beginner, if you're planning to get a telescope, I would say get a low, smallish focal length, so in the range of 500 to 600, or in the range of like 400 to 600 focal length, and uh, an aperture of maybe like 70 to 100 and that's because it's so these kinds of telescopes, you will usually find refractors which are in this range of focal length, and uh, these kinds of refractors are very light to use, and so they will be very easy to use with even a low quality mount, and so uh, try to get a light telescope with a medium focal length, because it will allow you to capture a vast array of objects while also being very easy to use. um,
Okay, that was the only doubt.
okay, so next let's go into astrophotography. And so there are three parts of astrophotography. The first, of course, is data collection. So in this frame here, you can see that this is a single shot, 45 seconds exposure of the West Whale Nebula, and uh, for most astrophotography images, a single shot will really not show you any detail. And you can see in this photo that all you can see is a bunch of stars, and there is no nebulosity, or nothing is visible. But if you collect a large number of these photos, and if you then stack these photos, which is the second step, then you can see a little bit of a faint amount of detail emerging in the center of this photo if you really squint your eyes, and if you sort of imagine there is something in the center of this photo. But again, it's very hard to see. And so this brings me to the final step of astrophotography, which is image processing. And really, this brings out all the faint detail that was missing in this stack, and you can do wonders with your photo. And really, most photos have this kind of detail hidden in them. But because there is this background light pollution, you cannot really see it, which you can fix in image processing by selectively removing this light pollution. And so I would say each of these steps is very important, uh, especially the data collection and image processing. But so today I'll be focusing mainly on data collection, and to show you what kinds of photos you can expect to capture with even basic equipment. Um, so what Before we go into all of that, so what kinds of data do we collect for astrophotography? So there are 5 different frames that if you want to make a good astrophoto, you should capture. So the first is called a light frame, which is the actual photo of the image of the object that you want to image. So in this case, it's just this Orion Nebula, and it's just the actual photos. Then the next frame that we should always capture is the dark frame, which is basically the same settings as the light frame, but with the lens cap or with the telescope shuttered off. And we do this because when you're taking long exposures of objects, the camera heats up over the course of like 30 seconds or over the course of 1 minute. And by taking dark frames at the same settings as the light frames, you are essentially eliminating any sort of thermal noise that arises in this photo. Then the next frame that we take is this bias frame, which is taken at the fastest shutter speed. So for my camera, it is 1/8000 of a second. And we take this to eliminate any electronic noise, because anytime you click a shutter, there is some electronics in the camera which forces the shutter to open, and this creates noise. And because all of these objects that we want to image are very faint, this kind of noise can really affect the outcome of your image. And so you want to eliminate this electronic noise, which is done by taking bias frames. And then The third kind that we take is this flat frames, where we essentially shine a uniform light source. So it can be a white wall in your house, or it can be a sheet of paper that you image. But this is, so we do this because we want to remove any sort of lens distortions that occur over the field that you're imaging. And so so flat frames help to eliminate that sort of distortion. And then the final is dark flat, which is essentially the same as, it's basically a dark frames for your flat frames, to eliminate the noise in your flat frames. Now for beginner astrophotography, you will probably not need to take bias flat or dark flats, and you'll get by with taking just light frames and dark frames, which I'll again talk about later. But these are the 5 main kinds of light or of data collection for astrophotography. So now let's look at, how do we collect this data? So for astrophotography, essentially, to collect data, what you need is a sensor that can image light, and you need something that focuses light onto that sensor. So any sort of camera that you have will work well. And so the basic kinds of astrophotography are with an iPhone camera, with a mobile phone camera, with a DSLR on a tripod, a DSLR with tracking, and then finally which is what most people do, is a DSLR with telescope. And I'll talk about each of these in turn. So let's now look at what sort of things you can hope to achieve with an iPhone camera. So because iPhone photography is mostly used with a telescope, and iPhones do not, or most phone cameras do not allow you a lot of manual control, so you're limited to short exposures. But you can really get excellent images of the moon and of most planets, and you can also, if the conditions are right, you can even image bright nebulae like the Orion Nebula. But because you're only doing single photos, there is no real need for darks or any of those other darks, bias frames, etc. So to show you a few of the things that I've captured. So here's what I did. Here's when I captured the moon with a 6-inch telescope. So this was just with my phone. I just held it up to the eyepiece of the telescope, and you can actually see very nice detail. And I was very happy with this photo. And again, so this was the total lunar eclipse in 2019 that I captured again with my phone, and you can actually see the red color of the moon. So that was it was a very good result. You can also capture the sun. So here's actually the photo of the Mercury transit that happened this year, and you can see this small black dot here is Mercury passing in front of the sun. But I should warn you, never ever point your telescope or actually any optics to the sun without a solar filter. It can potentially blind your eye. So be very careful if you're planning to image the sun. And so the main drawbacks of an iPhone camera or of a mobile phone camera are actually that it has a small aperture. And as we saw before, aperture means how much light it can collect. So a small aperture means it has low light gathering capacity. And because the sensor is also very small, it limits what you can capture. And so because of these two limitations, most of your images will be noisy. That's why that's why it's always used with the telescope, and we mostly use iPhones to capture the planets or the sun, moon, etc. But now, if you have a DSLR on a tripod without tracking, then that opens up a whole bunch of things that you can image. So before we go into sort of what you can do with this setup, I'll give you a few tips. So always use manual mode, because that allows you the most control. So you can set how long you want to take images. You can set your ISO, etc. Always use the lowest f number for your lens, because you want to maximize light collection. Then there is a very useful rule called the 500 rule, where if you want to image something without getting trails, then the maximum shutter speed that you can use is roughly 500 divided by the focal length of your lens. So if you have, let's say, a 20 lens, then the maximum shutter speed is 25 seconds. So this is a very useful rule, and it's a quick calculation will show you how much you can image for, and so that will also then be a good factor to decide how much ISO you should use. Because if you use too high, then it'll be noisy. Again, if you use too low, then you'll have to expose for a longer time, and so you'll get trails. So for most of these lenses, a good ISO range is in the range of 400 to 1600 at this aperture. And then one thing I'll say is always shoot in RAW. If you shoot in JPEG, then the camera processing algorithm removes a lot of the color and a lot of the details from the RAW files. So make sure you always shoot in RAW. Make sure you always process your photos in RAW. And then finally, when you're done with everything, then you can convert it to JPEG. One important tip for focusing is to you know look through the live view of your camera and find a bright star or a bright distant object. Really zoom in on the live view and make sure it's focused well. And optionally you can take darks, bias frames, etc. It's not very important for this kind of a setup. So let's look at what sort of images we can hope to capture with a DSLR on a tripod. So the first, of course, is taking photos of the Milky Way, or in general wide field photos. And for taking these kinds of photos, dark skies are really essential to get good data. So this photo I took when I was at Aries in Nainital. So it's an observatory, and they had really incredible skies. And so I was able to capture all of this detail that you see in the Milky Way. And it's hard to get this sort of detail from light polluted skies. So I would say that if you have the chance to go out of the city and get to a dark sky location, please do so, because it will give you really great detail on your photos. So the best times to image the Milky Way are from the end of March to the end of October. Ideally, in May or June, you should be able to get very nice photos, because the Milky Way will be up around midnight or so, and will be up when the sky is at its darkest. So you'll be able to get very nice photos of the Milky Way. So a good ISO range for capturing the Milky Way or capturing these wide field photos is an ISO range of 1600 to 6400 with a 20 to 30 seconds exposure, again depending on your lens. Speaking of wide field photos, there is also very nice nebulosity around the Orion constellation, which I'll show later, which you can also capture with this kind of setup. So the next thing you can do with a camera is you can capture star trails. So for star trails, the first thing I'll say is that the framing of the image is very important. So for example, one of my first star trails was just of the night sky without any foreground or without any object in front, and you can see it doesn't have as much of an impact as this image, where there is a foreground to give you sort of a sense of how big the night sky is. So I would say framing of the image is very important. Make sure you have a good foreground that you can enjoy. And then to capture star trails, a wide angle lens is very essential because you want to capture a large portion of the sky. So a lens up to 50 mm or less is ideal for capturing these kinds of star trails. Now for star trails, because you don't really care about trailing, you can use a low ISO, so in the range of 800 to 1600, and with a large exposure time, so over 30 seconds or so, and that will give you very nice, very clean images without any noise. So to take these images, most DSLRs have this interval timer mode, where you can set the gap between frames and how long each frame should be taken for. So it's very easy, just set it up to take around 100 or 200 frames. Once you've taken a test shot, so initially take a test shot to frame your image, to figure out what is the foreground, what is where the pole star is, and so on. Check your focus, etc. Check your white balance. Once you've checked all of those, and once you're happy with the first shot, then just set up the camera to take interval, to take photos every 30 or 40 seconds, and you can set it to take hundreds of photos. And then once you've set it up, you're actually you don't have much to do anymore. So 2 to 3 hours of such data will produce, very, very nice trails. And if you're ambitious, you can actually, set it up for like 6 hours or so, and actually capture the uh, whole hemisphere of, or whole semicircle of a single star, um, which looks very cool. Um, so the next thing that you can do is again wide field photos, but you can also capture meteors. So be on the lookout for meteor showers. They occur once every 2 months or so. And actually, there is a meteor shower at the end of this month. I think it's supposed to peak on the 28th of October. So, be on the lookout for that. And the way to capture a meteor is basically each meteor shower has a name that corresponds to the constellation from which the meteors seem to originate. So for example, if it's the Orionids, then that means that most if you trace a meteor back, then it seems to be coming from the Orion constellation. So what you can do is just set up your camera to point in the direction of that constellation, and set it up to take photo again, like a star trail. Set it up to take photos every 30 seconds to a minute, and then just hope that you get lucky and that you capture a meteor, as you can see here, which actually could have been just out of frame. So I was very lucky that I got to capture this one. And again, so when you're out capturing meteors, you will end up capturing a bunch of frames, and you should never waste any data. So you can also um, so you can also capture time-lapse videos. As you can see in this video here, I took a short video. You can see there are a bunch of meteors. There are some planes that cross my field of view. You can see clouds coming in. And you can also see the sky move. And so never let any data go to waste. Use your star trail data or your meteor data to produce time lapses like this. And really, here with time lapses, you can be very, very creative. You can add music. You can make a movie out of this. It's a very fun project if you are creative about it. Um, so the next thing that we'll look at is you can capture lunar eclipses with your cameras also. So partial eclipses occur around 2 to 5 times a year. And so this was taken actually last year in 2019. This was the total lunar eclipse. You can actually see the red color of the moon very well. It's very bright, very nice. And so to capture eclipses like these, a zoom lens is ideal. So 135 to 300 mm. If you have a lens like that, that's very nice to capture images of the moon. But because you're zooming in now, if you remember the 500 rule, a good exposure is around 1 to 2 seconds. And because you're limited to this kind of exposures, you have to go to a little bit of a higher ISO. So around 1600 to 3200. And also, because you're exposing for a longer time, you need a tripod for stability. Um, but uh, but because you're imaging the moon and stuff, you don't really have to worry about noise a lot. So you can afford to go to higher ISO and still get very clean, noise-free images. Um,
Varun,
Another thing, yes.
we just have a doubt about focusing at this point. What is the best method to focus in the dark? And I have heard that trying to focus on a distant object in auto mode in daytime and then switch to manual mode later, or using a tape to lock the focusing ring at nighttime, but it doesn't sound error proof. So are there any better options? Varun?
Zoom in as hello. Oh yeah, okay.
I think we lost your connection for a moment there. Please, could you
Yes,
repeat?
can you hear me now? Okay,
Yes, yes.
sorry. Yeah, so what I usually do to focus is, I if I'm doing these wide field images, then what I do is I go out, and I find a bright star in the night sky that is very easily visible, and then I point my camera to that star. And so my camera has this feature of live view. So what I can do is just turn live view on and really zoom in on the live view on the star, and so you can actually see the star in your in the live view. And then if you adjust the focus a little bit to get it as round as possible, that's usually good enough. And then once you've set the focus, really you don't have to touch it anymore. So you don't need tape or you don't need to mess with it. Once you've set it up, it doesn't change for the duration of the night. Um, so just find a bright star, zoom in on it on live view, and then focus using that. Or if your camera doesn't have live view and you cannot see a bright star, then I would say that during the daytime, before the sun sets and before you set up, choose your focal length of the lens that you want to image at, and then just find a very distant tree or a very distant house or something, and focus on that. And once you focus, just don't touch it anymore. Uh, so those are the two things I would say you can do. And I don't think you should use tape. It doesn't really help, and actually can disturb your focus. So just once you've set it up, don't mess with it.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. So then the next thing that we can do, and this is sort of a little bit of a niche area, but if you get the chance, I would definitely recommend that you try to image this, which is the Northern Lights. And so this is visible if you ever get a chance to go to the either the North Pole or the South Pole or in the Arctic regions. And if you do get the chance, it's very, very worthwhile. So I'll not spend too much time talking about this, just that, a wide angle lens is essential to have. And again, these kinds of ISO settings are good for these photos. And then finally, to end this section, I would say, you can take fun photos. You can be very creative with using just a camera. So you can, make a dull photo of the moon into something more fun by, adding something in front of it. Or for example, in this case, I made this photo for Christmas 2 years ago. And, it's really up to you how creative you are and how much fun you have with these kinds of photos. So the next thing that we'll be looking at is, how to connect a DSLR to a telescope. So there are two ways of doing it. One is with if you have your DSLR, then each company has what we call a T-ring, which fits into the slot where the lens goes. And then there is a camera to telescope adapter, which is called a T adapter. And then all of this combined together goes into the telescope. So this is called prime focus, and it's much easier to use because your camera is directly on the telescope, so you don't really have to work too hard. And then the other way is what I did when I started astrophotography for the first time, and this was actually my setup, which you can see here, is that I used this technique called eyepiece projection, where I had you have a DSLR and you just actually try to put it on the eyepiece of the telescope. So this is much harder to use because the lens of your DSLR is much wider than the eyepiece itself, and so it's hard to actually get the image onto your camera. But if you cannot get this sort of setup, then this setup works also. And so so what sort of things you can do with a telescope without tracking? So you can get a much closer look at the planets and the moon. These are very bright objects, so you don't really need a long exposure, and they make for really amazing images. You can also get decent images of very bright nebulae, like Orion, like the Orion Nebula, the Pleiades star cluster, or even the Andromeda galaxy. But again, if you remember the 500 rule, we are limited to short exposures, around 1 to 5 seconds. So usually you need to use high ISO, around 4,000 to 8,000, which lead to noisy images, especially for these bright nebulae. But to show you sort of how I began astrophotography, so this was actually a couple of my first photos. So I had this telescope, and I took these images of the moon and of Saturn, and this was using eyepiece projection. So I just held my DSLR onto the telescope, and I mean, you can see that I was really happy with these images because you can actually see some of the craters of the moon, and you can also see the rings of Saturn. So this was actually one of the finest images I took to start my astrophotography journey. Um, but because eyepiece projection is so hard, it's a struggle to get these kinds of images. So if you can get a T adapter and a T ring for your camera, it's much easier to do these kinds of images at prime focus. So you can see that this was the partial lunar eclipse taken through a 10-inch telescope, and you can also very clearly see this lower part of the moon was eclipsed by the Earth. Um, but more importantly, because the DSLR is at prime focus, it's much easier to achieve focus. It's much easier to capture the entire moon, um, and get really crisp images. Um, you can also do this for planets. So, for example, on the same night that I took this, I also took photos of Saturn, uh, and I was very happy because you can actually see, if you squint your eyes, you can see there is this gap in between Saturn's rings, which is called the Cassini division, and seeing that in the photo made my day. So you could also try this if you have access to a telescope. Um, and then some of the very first photos of nebulae that I took was of this Orion Nebula here, taken through the same telescope as before. And I also took the photos of this double cluster. But because it's a telescope, I'm limited to short exposures. So this was 1 second exposure each and just a single frame. So you can see these photos are pretty noisy. There is a lot of random stuff in the background, and there's also some trailing in these photos, as you can see, even at 1 second. So it's hard to get more than this using a telescope that's not tracking. Um, but you can also see the color in the Orion Nebula, which was again amazing. Um, so to recap, so this is basically sort of the beginner or the entry level astrophotography that most people have access to. So using iPhones, it's mostly used with a telescope. You can image Saturn, you can image planets, and the sun and the moon. And if you have a DSLR, that's that opens up a much larger amount of things you can do. So two important things. If you're using a DSLR on a tripod, you usually use a low to medium ISO, and remember the 500 rule. Um, and then the stuff to image is, of course, Milky Way, star trails, meteors, wide field images of Orion, etc., um, time lapses, solar or lunar eclipses, and so on. Um, and then if you have a DSLR with a telescope, but it's not tracking, then you're limited to higher ISO and short exposures. But again, you can get some decent photos of bright nebulae, and you can get really really nice photos of the planets and of the moon and the sun. So if anyone has any questions so far, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll move ahead to the sort of the next level of astrophotography.
We have one doubt. You were explaining about the light frames and dark frames. So, what is the average number of frames that you should be taking?
Yeah, that's a good question. So for light frames, usually you want to take as many as possible because light frames is the object that you're capturing. So the more light frames you have, the better it is. For dark frames, ideally you would have dark frames to be the same number as the light frames, but for most cases it's impractical to take so many dark frames. So usually what I end up doing is I take around half an hour to 45 minutes worth of dark frames for each of my photos, and that works well enough. But ideally you should have it as many as the light frames. um, and then the bias frames and the flat frames, so those you only need to take them once for your camera because it doesn't really change much over the course of a camera's life. And for bias frames, I would say, because you're taking it at the shortest shutter speed, so take as many as you can. 100 to 200 are good because it's 1/8,000 of a second, so you can afford to take as many as you can. And for flat frames, again, it's a similar number. So because you're taking this only once for your camera, take as many as you can. So again, 100 to 200 is a good number.
Okay. And is there any utility of the 2x extenders in this?
The sorry, what extenders?
The extenders of a telescope, the 2x, 3x
Oh, the
extenders,
Barlow. Okay.
Barlow.
Yeah. So those are actually very nice to capture the planets, and especially and also good to capture certain images on the certain areas of the moon. For example, if you really want to zoom in on a crater on the moon, then it's nice to have those Barlow lenses. But the problem with those is that it makes it very hard to find an object and to keep that object in the field of view, because if you're extending the focal length by 2x or 3x, you're also narrowing the field of view, and objects move very fast in those using those lenses or those extenders. So they are good to image planets and the sun and the moon, but they're also harder to use. um,
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so let's now go to the sort of the next level of astrophotography that you can do, which is that you use a DSLR with a star tracker. So in this photo, this white box here, that's the star tracker, which is an it's called the Ioptron Sky Tracker, shown here. And so this essentially tracks the night sky, and if you have such a setup, then it opens up a lot of what you can image, because these kinds of sky trackers, they can track objects automatically after solar alignment. So so if you do this polar alignment well, and I'll explain what polar alignment means, then you can achieve even 1 minute exposures without any sort of trailing. And so these are really nice things to have if you want to start out with astrophotography. And a typical one like this Ioptron Sky Tracker costs around $400 in the US, or around 40,000 rupees in India. So it's not very expensive, but if you do get it, it's very nice to have. And again, a few tips: always use the lowest f number, and but because now we can go to 1 minute exposures, we can afford to use a lower ISO. So in 400 to 1600 range is very nice. So for one thing I'll say is, with the star tracker, always take darks, because now you are exposing for a long duration, and so the camera will heat up over the course of a minute or so, and to eliminate that sort of noise, it's nice to have these dark frames. So what is polar alignment? So this this sky tracker here, this long cylinder that you see here, that's called a polar scope. And so if you look through the polar scope, and you point the star tracker towards the north, and you look through the polar scope, you will you should be able to locate Polaris, or the North Star, somewhere. And what you want to do is, there's this app called Polar Align, which helps you locate where you should be placing the pole star when you look through the polar scope. So what you see when you look through the polar scope is this sort of these concentric circles with these numbers written on them, which basically correspond to different locations of Polaris in the night sky. And if you set Polaris, that is, if you move the mount and set Polaris to be at the correct spot indicated by the app, then that means you've done polar alignment, which means that your mount axis is now aligned with the Earth's axis. So if you do this step, then you can easily get exposures of more than 1 minute. And if you get polar alignment very accurate and very very spot on, then you can do even like 2 minutes or even 3 minutes of exposures, which is very very useful to image these faint deep sky objects. And so to give you a few examples of sort of what you can achieve with this kind of setup, one of the first things I imaged was the Orion Nebula. And you can see now that it's a very crisp photo. There is very little noise, and you can very easily see all of the the colors in the nebulosity. You can also see some of the faint nebulosity in the star here. Uh, and so you can actually shoot these bright nebulae even in light polluted skies. Um, and a few tips for shooting objects like these. A zoom lens is optimal. If you have somewhere in the range of 135 to 300 that's very nice, because those sky trackers can handle the weight of a DSLR with this kind of lens. Um, so I use a 200 f5.6 lens to capture this particular shot. And you can see that. So one tip again for focusing is, zoom. Live view is a very useful feature on the camera. Really zoom into the live view of your camera on a particular star, and try to get it as round as possible. And because again, as I said, we can expose now for more than a minute or so. uh, Use low ISOs so that you can eliminate sort of most of the noise in the image. um, and so here's an example of long exposure astrophotography, because I took data for around 1.5 hours to get this image. So you want to take as much data as possible. um, and ideally you would even go longer, like 2 hours, 3 hours, or how much ever is convenient for you. More data never hurts. Then the next thing you can also do is, you can capture these big bright star clusters called. So for example, here's the Pleiade star cluster, and this was using the same setup as the previous photo. And again, uh, I use similar settings, but this was for a longer total exposure. And you can see like some of the faint nebulosity, some of the faint dust around these stars emerging out of the photo. But it's hard to capture this very, very faint details in light polluted skies. So if you have the chance to take this star tracker and go to a dark sky site, then you would get really, really amazing images. Um, and then one more thing you can do is, you can get really these wide field images of the Orion Nebula. So for, the Orion constellation has a lot of nebulosity in this region. So you can see this, this red arc here in this photo. You can see the Orion Nebula, of course. You can see this Horsehead Nebula here. So it's you can really do photos like this using just a simple star tracker. And because this is such a wide field photo, you need so this was a low focal number, a focal length lens, so around 18 is good for this kind of photos. um, and but again, a word of caution is that to get this kind of data, to get this kind of colors to pop out in your image, you really need to go to a dark sky site. So this kind of photos is simply not possible through light polluted skies, because the light pollution is much brighter than the brightness of this this faint nebula here. um, so if you get the chance, I would suggest for any sort of astrophotography, just really go to a dark sky site. And that helps a lot. uh, okay, so these are more or less the kind of things you can do with a star tracker. But now let's go to the really the final level of astrophotography, which is a DSLR with a telescope with tracking. And so this is where this opens up the entire night sky. Really, you can capture the entire universe is in your hands now. And so in these kinds of setups, uh, the camera is always mounted at prime focus. So using a T-ring and a T-adapter, you can see it's mounted to the telescope itself. Um, so for this kind of setup, again, you always need an equatorial mount, as I explained before, and you need to have tracking in both axes. And this kind of setup is most commonly used with refractor telescopes because they are very light and easy to use. Um, a word of caution here is that this can get now very, very technical, because there are so many different aspects that you can go wrong in, or that you can optimize. For example, polar alignment, or what sort of lens you should have, or what sort of telescope you should have, what sort of filters you should use, guiding, and there's really a bunch of things that start to emerge at this level here. And also this hobby can get really expensive really quickly. So it's, while it is a lot of fun and I really enjoy the technical aspects, I feel like I should warn you, because this is a fact that's often ignored, is that it can get very expensive very quickly. Um, so one word of caution again is that it's really all in the mount. If you want to image anything, it's really, you cannot go wrong in the mount, because if you screw up the mount, then all of your photos will end up being bad. And so if you want to go into this, if you want to delve into this advanced level of astrophotography, then here are a few important factors that you should know if you want to purchase a mount, which is that the entire payload of the telescope and your camera must be a couple of pounds or more less than the stated payload. So each mount has some capacity that it can handle. For example, I think this mount has around 20 pounds, which is I think around 9 kilos. And so your the telescope plus the camera weight should be less than that by at least 1 kilogram. The mount should also have dual axis tracking. So there are two axes called the RA and declination. You should have tracking in both these axes. You should also have a polar scope with the mount to be able to accurately polar align the mount. And so it's a whenever you're buying a new mount, it's always a compromise between your budget and mount quality. But I will say that it's better to have no mount than to have a cheap mount. So if you are looking to try this sort of astrophotography, then I would say save up for a good mount. Like if you buy a cheap mount, it'll lead you to a lot of frustration, and so that's just not good. So save up for a big nice mount. And so what's a good starter sort of setup for this kind of astrophotography is that a good mount is an EQ4 mount, which has both dual axis drives, and then a short focal length refractor with any DSLR, which costs around $1,000 in the US, this entire setup, or around 90,000 rupees in India. So what is an EQ4 mount? So there are these three popular mount companies called Skywatcher, Celestron, and Orion. There are other companies also, but these three are sort of the three big, most well-known companies. And so if you buy a mount from any of these three companies, then it's guaranteed to be a good stable mount. So each of these companies has their own series of mounts. Skywatcher has this EQ3, EQ4, EQ5 series. And then they also have these more advanced mounts, which are these HEQ5, EQ6, EQ8, so on. Skywatcher also makes the camera tracker, like I showed before, called the Star Adventurer. So this is a very, very well-known company. I think India has a few branches of this company, so it's much easier to get a hand on any of these mounts in India. And then again, similarly, Celestron and Orion, they also have their series of mounts. But like I said before, save up to get one of these better mounts, either the EQ4, EQ5, or the CG4, CG5. I would say for Orion, this EQ series is not good at all. So I would say don't get any of these mounts, because they will not be able to provide accurate tracking, and then you'll see a lot of trails, and then it'll just not be worth the money. With that said, though, if you do get such kind of a setup, then you can really do very, very nice images. And most of these images are possible even under light polluted skies. So for example, you can see here this photograph of the Orion of the Andromeda galaxy, which I took from my backyard in light polluted skies. And so a few tips, if you do end up getting this sort of setup, is that always shoot at low ISO, because we will be always shooting exposures of 1 minute or more. So to eliminate any sort of noise, you always want to shoot at ISO in the range of 100 to 1600. One important thing is to take as much data as possible. Take data over multiple nights if your object is too faint, but really the more data you have, the better the better your final image will look, and the more details you will also end up seeing in the final image. Um, so now, focusing on this sort of system is a little bit hard, because you can't just point to any faraway building. Um, but once you get your hands on this, and once you get sort of proficient at operating the system, the best way to focus is to find a bright star, and again to go on the live view of your camera, zoom into the bright star as much as possible, and then just make sure the star is round. So it's a standard technique for focusing that I use everywhere, which is again zooming in and focusing. Um, One word of caution here is, locating these faint objects is hard. Um, so there is this popular technique called star hopping, which is, that if you know that the Andromeda galaxy is, it's close to this constellation, then you can find bright stars in the constellation and hop from one star to the next until you get to the Andromeda galaxy. Um, so this is a very nice technique to use, um, and in most cases, like I showed before, your single shot will show you almost no detail of the object that you're capturing. And so the best way to make sure you have actually you do have the object in a frame of view is to match your image, or match the stars that you can see in your image to sort of a reference image that you can, to any reference image you can find online. um, but again, the setup, while it's very worth it, and you can really make amazing photographs with this sort of a setup. And just to show you sort of the few things that I've done with this setup, you can capture galaxies. So you have, here's the Pinwheel galaxy, here's the Whirlpool galaxy, and all of the I have the same setup for all of my images, which is this small 72 mm refractor on a beginner level mount. It's a CG4 mount, which is kind of equivalent to the EQ4 that I mentioned earlier. And you can see that all of these images were taken over like 2 hours or 3 hours, and that's because you want to eliminate a lot of the noise. One thing I'll point out is, so I think this was the very first photo I took, and you can see there's a lot of noise in this photo, and that's because I didn't do a good job processing this photo. So I'll talk a little bit about image processing later also. Um, and then, so you can capture all these galaxies. You can capture star clusters. So here's the Hercules cluster, which is a very dense star cluster in Hercules. And for star clusters, you don't really have to image for a long time, because these are bright by themselves. And so even a short, like even 1 hours to 1.5 hours is good enough for these kinds of photos. And then, of course, you can also image nebulae. So here's the Westwhale Nebula that I showed earlier. Here's the Ring Nebula. And for this Westwhale Nebula, this was actually my most ambitious project till date, because it's a very, very faint nebula. And I had to actually image over 3 nights for over 7 hours of total data to get this sort of image. So, once you get into this hobby, it's really hard to, stop yourself from taking a lot of data. And it's also worth it, because you can see a lot of the colors in this data, in this nebula. So that sort of brings me to the final slide, which is what other things you can capture. So be on the lookout for comets. This was comet Neowise, which was a few months back, and it's a very, very bright comet. I just took this for over 1 hour. You can also see a lot of the nice color, the green head of the comet, and you can also see the tail of the comet, which is very nice. And then you can also capture the moon. And one thing about the moon is a lot of people are not aware, but the moon actually has a lot of color on the surface, and you can see a lot of this color in this photo. There's some sand here, which is brownish, and then there is some blue here, which is it's wonderful to see color on the moon, because most images of the moon are white. So that's sort of a brief overview of what kinds of things you can do with this advanced equipment. And so if anyone has any questions so far, feel free to ask. Otherwise, I'll move on to the next section, which is stacking. So I'll only spend about 1 slide on this. So these are the two main softwares that I use for stacking. StarStax is a very nice software that is used to stack star trails. They have a bunch of different settings that you can use. Uh, One caveat about StarStax is that it only accepts JPEG images. I don't know why, but so if you're shooting in RAW, if you're actually doing star trails, I would say maybe shoot in JPEG if you're planning to use this software. There are other softwares out there, but I have used this in the past and it's very useful. Um, and then the other software is Deep Sky Stacker, which I use for stacking my photos of the deep sky objects taken through my telescope. So this software can be used for nebulae, galaxies, clusters, Milky Way, etc. And I'll quickly point out that Deep Sky Stacker has this option where you can import the picture files, which is the light frames, the dark frames, flat frames, dark flat, and bias frames. So this is really a dedicated software to stack deep sky photos. And then the final thing that, again, I'll not spend too much time talking about is image processing, which is that how do you go from a photo that looks like this, a stacked photo that looks like this, to a photo that looks like this. And this image processing is really an art, and you have to spend a lot of time going through this and trying multiple things before you get good enough that you can do uh, image processing like this. But I'll show you a few steps that I usually take. And so the first thing that I always do is adjust levels in Photoshop. So I'm assuming that most of you will be doing image processing in Photoshop because that's the software I'm familiar with. So the first thing I always do is adjust levels multiple times. So you can see here's the raw photo, the stacked photo. Then if I adjust levels once, which is that I bring in this light point, bring the dark point here, then you can see sort of some detail emerging. And then if I do this again, you can see again more detail pop out here. And then the next thing I do after adjusting levels is adjusting curves. So this is again something in Photoshop where you can adjust sort of how the histogram looks, and you can see that after two applications of curves, a lot of the detail is popping out in the image. One other thing you can see is that my camera was dirty for this image that I took, and there are a bunch of these spots, which is I think just dust on my camera sensor. So to avoid this, make sure your camera is clean. But if you do get this, you can always sort of remove them during the processing stage. And so a final thing about processing, always revisit your old photos. It's this was my first attempt at the Whale Nebula, and you can see that I didn't really do a good job. The background is way too dark. You can see that there is this. You can easily tell that I have separately edited the nebula itself as compared to the background and so on. But when I revisited this photo a week later, I was able to do a much better job. So if you have old data, or if you actually keep revisiting your old photos, you'll always end up doing something better. And so finally, I would say that congratulations on choosing astrophotography as a hobby. It's a very, very fun hobby. Also very expensive, so be prepared to spend a lot of money. But stick to the hobby. It takes time to develop the skill, but it's very rewarding. And over the course of around 3 to 4 years, I've gone from taking images like this, where you can barely see anything, to images like the image of this comet Neowise, where you can see a lot of detail. So stick to the hobby. I'm sure you'll get something out of it. There is something in this hobby for everyone, regardless of what kind of equipment you have. And so I hope you have enjoyed the talk, and that you found something useful from this talk. So thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Varun. We just have a few questions. What is your take on stargazing apps, and are they accurate?
Um, yeah, so Stellarium is very accurate. You will there are other apps also, which I personally only use Stellarium because it's very useful. It's a very easy software to use, and it's pretty accurate. Like if you zoom in on individual stars and if you use that to sort of star hop to your target, you will always get the right result. So it's very accurate.
And are there any official courses that we can do on astrophotography by any organization?
There is no organization that has courses, but there are a few well-known astrophotographers who have their courses online. So, for example, there is this very popular astrophotographer called Astro Backyard. So he has a YouTube channel which is called Astro Backyard, um, and he has a course which is very nice on astrophotography. He's a very well-known photographer, so that's something that's useful. Um, Although no, I don't think any institution as such offers any courses on astrophotography.
Okay. Does anyone else have any doubts? Please type it in the chat box. Okay, so if there are no more doubts, then Varun, thank you so much. You've really taken a lot of effort in making the entire presentation yourself, and especially when you're so busy with all your research work going on at Yale. So thank you so much for taking out your time for this for us and for sharing your knowledge with us. And with that, like I want to thank you on behalf of the entire BJMC College Clubs Committee.
Thank
And
you. I'm very excited to give this talk.
thank you. And if there are any no more doubts, then I think we can call the meeting to a close.
Okay. Thanks. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah,
Thanks, everyone.
thanks everyone. Thanks Varun. Thanks Rishi.
I'll just end meeting for everyone, Rushi.
Yes, okay.